The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl locked in his old clubhouse, and his answer broke through steel and history. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's get into it. It was a cold winter's night, the kind where the wind bites at your skin and the streets are eerily quiet. Jake Morrison, known to some as Reaper, a Hells Angels biker with years of history and scars to prove it, rode through the small, desolate town of Black River. His Harley-Davidson roared through the empty streets, the sound of the engine reverberating off the walls of abandoned buildings. He wasn't sure why he stopped. Maybe it was the stormy weather or just his mind wandering back to the old days. But something was different that night. He parked his bike near the entrance of his old clubhouse, a place he hadn't stepped foot in for years. The rusted doors, cracked windows, and weather-beaten walls seemed to tell the story of his past, a time of brotherhood, loyalty, and things he wasn't proud of. As he stood by the bike, wiping the snow off his jacket, he heard something, a faint noise that made his heart skip a beat. A soft cry, almost drowned by the wind, came from inside the clubhouse. He hesitated for a moment. He had left that life behind, the violence, the chaos. He was no longer the man who would answer a call for help with force. But the sound of that cry tugged at something deep inside him. Without thinking, he approached the front door, his boots crunching in the snow. The door creaked open with a loud protest, and as Jake stepped inside, he saw her, a little girl, no older than 8 or 9, trapped in a small, dark room, her face streaked with tears. Her tiny hands gripped the bars of the old cell, a remnant of a time when the clubhouse was used for much darker purposes. Her eyes widened with fear as she saw Jake, her small body trembling. She thought he was one of them. She thought he was going to hurt her. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. Jake froze, the words striking him harder than he expected. He was a hardened man, someone who had been through more than his fair share of violence. But the innocence in her voice, the sheer terror, made him pause. He wasn't sure what it was that made him take that first step toward her, but he did. Slowly, cautiously, he knelt down in front of the girl. His rough hands, calloused from years of hard work and fighting, now moved with surprising gentleness. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, his voice steady but kind. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. She couldn't understand why this man, who looked like a monster, wasn't threatening her. But Jake's voice, calm and reassuring, seemed to slowly melt the walls she had built around herself. "What's your name?" Jake asked, trying to connect with her in any way he could. The girl's lips trembled as she spoke. "Emily," she whispered, her voice still shaky. I was locked in here. I don't know why." Jake felt a pang of guilt. He had been a part of this place, a part of the hell that it represented, and now here was this innocent child, stuck in the middle of it all. Without thinking, he gently reached for the rusty lock, the one that had kept Emily imprisoned in this nightmare. He didn't have the key, but that didn't matter. He wasn't about to leave her in here. With a few strong pulls, he broke the lock, the sound of metal snapping filling the room. The door creaked open, and Emily stumbled out, falling into his arms. She was light, fragile, and Jake could feel her heartbeat racing in her chest. He held her close, not knowing what to say, not knowing how to make it better. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her go. Not now. Not ever. As they stood there, the storm outside beginning to grow fiercer, Jake made a vow to himself. He had broken the steel lock that kept her trapped, but there was something deeper, something stronger that needed to be unlocked. The door to redemption, not just for Emily, but for him as well. And so, as the snow continued to fall, Jake Morrison, the Hells Angels biker, made a promise. He would protect this child, no matter what it took. Jake slowly stood up, holding Emily in his arms, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The cold wind from outside howled through the broken windows of the clubhouse, but inside, there was a strange warmth between them. The storm was growing stronger, but Jake wasn't about to let this little girl go. Not now. Not after everything she'd been through. He carried her carefully, every step heavy with a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. He had no idea what he was doing, no idea how to take care of her, but he knew one thing. He couldn't leave her behind. He stepped outside the clubhouse, the snow swirling around them in thick, icy flakes. He barely noticed the chill as he made his way toward his Harley, parked just a few feet away. The engine, still cold from the earlier ride, hummed to life when he turned the ignition, the sound cutting through the winter air. He gently set Emily down on the seat behind him, wrapping her up in his leather jacket to protect her from the cold. She shivered slightly, but didn't protest. She trusted him. The trust in her eyes, though still cautious, made something shift in Jake's chest. As he revved the engine, he couldn't help but wonder how it had come to this. How this little girl, so full of fear and uncertainty, had ended up in his life. And how he, a man who had long forgotten what it meant to care, had found himself willing to protect her with everything he had. He looked over his shoulder, meeting her gaze. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. Emily nodded silently, her small hands gripping the back of his jacket as they began to ride. The wind whipped through their hair as they sped through the streets of Black River, the town barely visible beneath the falling snow. Jake knew where he was going, back to his garage. It wasn't much, just a place he used to work. On bikes, but it was safe, and it was the only place he could think of to take her. As they rode, Jake's mind raced. He couldn't shake the image of Emily's frightened face when she first saw him, her eyes filled with so much fear that it was almost too much to bear. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know fear when he saw it. And yet, there was something different about this, about Emily. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid of what he represented. She trusted him, and that was a heavy weight to carry. He pushed those thoughts aside as they pulled up to the garage. The place was exactly how he remembered it. Old, worn down, but still standing strong against the test of time. He parked his bike in front of the large steel doors and swung his leg over, helping Emily down carefully. "This is where we're staying for now," he said softly, trying to sound reassuring, though he didn't know how to make her feel safe in a place like this. Inside, the garage was cold and dimly lit. Tools were scattered across the workbenches, and the faint smell of motor oil lingered in the air. It was a place Jake had spent countless hours, but now, it felt different. It felt like a home, or at least it could be. He helped Emily inside and set her down on the old couch in the corner. She was quiet, her eyes scanning the room as if trying to understand where she was. Jake watched her for a moment, feeling a strange mix of protectiveness and guilt. He didn't know how to be what she needed, but he knew he couldn't let her down. "I'll get you something to eat," Jake said, his voice softening for the first time. Emily looked up at him, her eyes still full of uncertainty, but there was a glimmer of something else, trust. Jake walked over to the small kitchenette in the back of the garage, rummaging through the cupboards for whatever food he had. It wasn't much, some canned beans and crackers, but it would have to do for now. As he heated up the food, his mind wandered back to the old days. The days when he was part of the Hells Angels, when everything was about loyalty, strength, and never showing weakness. But now, standing in his old garage, with a little girl depending on him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, vulnerability. He set a plate of food in front of Emily, watching as she took the first bite hesitantly. She wasn't starving, but she looked exhausted, as though the weight of everything she had been through had finally caught up with her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but sincere. Jake nodded, unsure of what to say. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice thick with emotion he didn't know how to process. They sat there in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the small heater in the corner. Jake felt a strange peace settle over him. This wasn't what he had planned, but somehow, it felt right. Emily was safe for now, and that was all that mattered. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not while he was around. Jake woke up the next morning to the sound of soft breathing beside him. The garage, now filled with a sense of quiet, felt different. It was no longer just an old, abandoned place for fixing bikes. Now, it was a shelter, a home of sorts. Emily was still sleeping on the couch, curled up under the thick blankets Jake had found in the back of the garage. The morning sunlight streamed through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Jake rubbed his eyes, trying to push away the exhaustion from the night before. He hadn't slept much, his mind racing with thoughts of Emily and the promise he had made to himself. He couldn't help but feel like a man who had been given a second chance at something he had long abandoned. The night before, he had found himself talking to Emily, telling her about his past, about the Hells Angels and the choices he'd made that led him to where he was now. He'd never talked about any of it before, not like that. But something about her, something in her innocent, trusting eyes, made him open up in ways he hadn't expected. He looked over at her now, her small chest rising and falling with each breath, her face relaxed in sleep. She was safe for now, and that was all that mattered. Jake stood up quietly, making sure not to wake her. He walked over to the old fridge in the corner and pulled out what little food he had left. The canned beans from the night before were still sitting there, but he didn't want to feed her the same thing again. There was a small store a few miles away, and he could probably make the trip before Emily woke up. He grabbed his jacket and made his way outside. The cold air hit him as he stepped out of the garage, the snow still falling in heavy sheets. It was early, but the town of Black River was already starting to wake up. People were clearing their driveways, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. Jake didn't mind the cold. He had spent enough years riding through all kinds of weather. But today, the cold seemed to wrap itself around him differently. He wasn't just a man on a bike anymore. He had a purpose now. The store was small but well-stocked, with everything from canned goods to fresh produce. Jake walked in, his boots leaving muddy prints on the linoleum floor. The clerk, an older man with graying hair, looked up from the counter and gave Jake a wary glance. Jake didn't mind. People in Black River had always looked at him like he was a threat, and he had given them plenty of reasons to feel that way. But today, he didn't care about their stares. He was here for Emily. He picked up a few things, some bread, fruit, and a couple of fresh cans of beans. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. As he was heading to the counter, the clerk spoke up. "You know, there's been talk around here," he said, his voice low. Jake turned to face him, raising an eyebrow. "Talk about what?" The clerk hesitated before continuing. "About the little girl. People say she's been through a lot. No one knows where she came from, but there's a lot of whispers." Jake's stomach tightened. He didn't like the way the man was looking at him. It wasn't curiosity, it was judgment. "She's fine," Jake replied, his voice flat. "Just stay out of it." The clerk didn't say anything else, but Jake could feel the weight of the man's gaze on him as he made his way to the counter to pay. It wasn't the first time Jake had felt eyes on him. People had always been quick to judge him, to assume the worst. And maybe they were right. Maybe he had been the kind of man who deserved to be feared. But that was before Emily, before he had promised to protect her. After paying, Jake left the store and made his way back to the garage. The snow had thickened, and the town was even quieter than before. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He hadn't expected to become someone's protector. He had never thought he'd find redemption in saving a little girl. But as he reached the garage and pushed open the door, he saw Emily sitting up on the couch, her eyes wide awake. She was looking around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Jake set the bags down on the table and walked over to her. "Hey, how you feeling?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Emily smiled at him, though it was a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm okay," she said, her voice quiet. "What's your name?" "Jake," he replied, sitting down beside her. "And you're Emily, right?" She nodded. For a moment, they sat there in silence. Jake didn't know what to say. He wasn't good with words, especially not with kids. But Emily's presence in his life had opened something inside him, something he thought he had buried a long time ago. He was trying to be better, trying to make up for the things he had done. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her. Emily was still so young, so fragile. She had been through things no child should ever have to experience. And Jake had made a promise to himself to make sure she would never have to face that again. "We'll get through this," Jake said finally, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth in his words. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. And in that moment, Jake realized something. He wasn't just protecting her. She was saving him too. Jake spent the next few days in a state of quiet unease. He had spent years riding alone, away from any real connections. But now, Emily was in his life, and it was impossible to ignore the pull she had on him. It was more than just the promise he had made to protect her. There was something else, something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of responsibility, of needing to care for someone again. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way. The Hells Angels, his past, had always been about survival, loyalty, and living without regrets. But everything had changed. He wasn't sure he was ready for the changes, but he knew he had no choice. He had to be better, for her. Emily was still adjusting to her new surroundings. She spent most of her time in the garage, drawing pictures on the scraps of paper Jake had found. She was quiet, her eyes constantly scanning the space, as if expecting something to jump out at her. Jake didn't blame her. Her life had been full of trauma, full of fear. But he saw moments when her guard lowered, even if just for a second. Like when she smiled at the simple things, the way the light filtered through the windows in the morning, or when he found an old and used bike part and showed it to her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They were starting to build a bond. One afternoon, after a long morning of cleaning up the garage, Jake decided to take Emily on a short ride. He figured it would be a good distraction, a chance for them both to feel some freedom. He had kept the bike idle for a few days, knowing the road would help clear his head. But when he looked over at Emily, sitting quietly on the couch, her eyes downcast, he knew it was time to take that step forward. "You want to go for a ride?" he asked. Emily looked up at him, her face still uncertain, but she nodded slowly. It wasn't a yes, but it was something. "We'll go slow," Jake said, his voice soft. She nodded again. Jake grabbed his helmet and went to the back to start the bike. He could feel her watching him, and for a moment, he thought about the life he had left behind. The Hells Angels, the chaos, the violence. It had all been his world. But this was different. He didn't know where this road was taking him, but he was ready to follow it. When he returned to the front of the garage, Emily was standing there, her small figure wrapped in the old leather jacket Jake had given her. She looked like a tiny version of him, the helmet slightly too big for her. Jake helped her onto the bike, her hands clutching his jacket as she climbed behind him. She was quiet, but there was something different in the way she held on to him. It wasn't fear, it was trust. As they rode through the town of Black River, the cold wind hitting their faces, Jake felt the weight of the past slowly lifting. The road stretched ahead of them, a ribbon of freedom and possibility. For a moment, there were no shadows of the past, no burdens. It was just the two of them, riding side by side, finding a new rhythm. Jake had spent years trying to outrun his past. But here, with Emily, he felt like he was moving towards something new. He didn't know what it was yet, but he could feel it in the air, in the way Emily had started to look at him, not as a stranger, not as a man lost in his past, but as someone who was finally showing up, someone who was finally ready to be there for her. They stopped by the small pond just outside town, a quiet spot Jake used to visit when he needed to clear his head. He took off his helmet and turned to Emily. She was still standing a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the water. "You all right?" Jake asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. Emily nodded, but this time, she didn't look down. She met his gaze, her eyes soft and full of something he hadn't expected. "I think I'm okay," she said quietly. Jake smiled, relieved to hear her voice more steady, more sure of herself. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might just have a chance at finding peace. The ride back to the garage was quieter, but in a good way. There was no rush, no urgency, just the sound of the engine humming beneath them, the wind cutting through the air. As they returned to the garage, Emily turned to Jake. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but sincere. Jake looked at her, feeling a lump in his throat. He had spent so long fighting against the world, against everything and everyone. But here, with Emily, there was something worth fighting for. "You don't have to thank me," Jake said softly, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We're in this together." It wasn't much, but it was enough. As they walked back into the garage, Jake felt something stir within him, a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he had a chance at redemption. And this time, he wasn't going to run away. The days that followed felt like a blur. Jake found himself waking up early every morning, the cold air biting at his skin as he stepped outside to start his bike. The routine was simple, but it had a grounding effect on him. Emily had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't anticipated, and although they hadn't said much to each other since that first ride, the bond between them was undeniable. She was still quiet, still guarded. But Jake noticed the little things, the way she smiled more now, the way she trusted him a little more each day. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jake was working on a bike in the garage one afternoon when Emily approached him. She was holding a small notebook in her hands, and there was a hesitant look on her face. She had been drawing a lot lately, filling the pages with pictures of things she'd never seen before. Things like the motorcycle, the garage, and even Jake himself. She was a child, after all, but the innocence in her eyes had softened something deep inside him. "Hey, Jake," she said softly, her voice still small but gaining strength. I drew something." Jake looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's that?" he asked, his voice gentle. She handed him the notebook, and as he flipped through the pages, he saw her sketches, drawings of him, of the bike, and one that stood out above the rest. It was a drawing of the two of them, riding together on the Harley, the wind blowing through their hair, the open road stretching out before them. Jake smiled, his heart tightening in his chest. "This is really good, Emily," he said quietly. "You've got talent." She beamed at the compliment, the first real smile Jake had seen in days. But as she sat down next to him, her face grew serious again. "I want to help you fix things," she said, her voice firm with determination. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Help me fix what?" "The bike," she said, pointing to the old Harley sitting in the corner. "I can help you. I've been learning about engines. I want to learn how to fix them, like you." Jake stared at her for a moment, surprised by her request. He hadn't expected her to ask for something like that. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something more than just a desire to learn. He saw hope, and he saw the child that had been forced to grow up too fast, looking for a way to feel useful again. He thought about it for a second before nodding slowly. "All right," he said, setting down his tools. "But this isn't just about fixing bikes. It's about learning, and you've got to be patient. You up for that?" Emily nodded eagerly, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I can do it," she said, her voice confident. Over the next few days, they worked together on the bike. Jake would explain things to her step by step, and Emily would listen intently, absorbing every word. She wasn't the fastest learner, but she was determined, and that was enough for Jake. He had spent so much of his life alone, doing everything on his own terms. But now, with Emily by his side, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. As they worked on the bike, Jake found himself teaching her not just about engines and repairs, but about life. He taught her how to be patient, how to pay attention to the smallest details, and how to never give up. And in return, Emily taught him something he hadn't realized he needed to learn: how to care again. One afternoon, as they were tightening the last bolts on the bike, Emily looked up at Jake. "Jake, do you think I could ever, ride a bike like you do?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Jake hesitated for a moment, considering her question. He had been so caught up in making sure she was safe that he hadn't really thought about the future. But as he looked at her, he realized something. Emily was growing stronger every day. She wasn't the same scared little girl he had found locked in the clubhouse. She was becoming someone new, someone who had the strength to take on whatever came her way. "You'll ride one day, Emily," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "You'll ride when you're ready." Her face lit up with a smile, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but with Emily by his side, he knew he could face it. That night, after a long day of work, they sat together in the garage, the bike finally finished. Emily had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's work, but Jake couldn't sleep. He stood in front of the bike, running his hand along the metal frame, taking in the sight of it. It was more than just a bike now. It was a symbol of everything he had come to care about, everything he had promised to protect. He thought back to the days when he had been lost, when he had been consumed by the Hell's Angels, and the need to prove himself. But now, everything was different. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Emily. And for the first time in years, Jake didn't feel so alone. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, there would be moments of doubt, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Emily down. And no matter what came their way, he was ready to face it, with her by his side. Jake woke up the next morning with a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't the usual weight of the past that had always hung over him. This was something different. He had kept his promise to Emily, and the two of them were building something together, something stronger than he had ever thought possible. It was a bond, fragile but growing, formed out of trust and necessity. As the days went on, he started to realize how much this little girl had changed him. She had become his focus, his reason to keep moving forward, and her quiet resilience was teaching him to hope again. He watched her more closely now. She was still quiet, her eyes often lost in thought, but she was also beginning to open up more. She was no longer the scared child he had found locked in the clubhouse. Every day, she seemed to gain more strength, more confidence. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live again. Jake had noticed a change in himself as well. The garage was no longer just a place to escape. It had become their shared space, a place where they could rebuild, not just the bikes, but themselves. Emily had been helping him with the bike repairs every day. It wasn't easy, but she was determined. She had learned quickly, and Jake found himself admiring her perseverance. What was even more surprising was how much he had learned from her. He had spent most of his life believing he didn't need anyone. But now, as he watched Emily work on the bike with the same intensity he had once had, he realized how wrong he had been. They were a team now, and he couldn't remember the last time he had felt this sense of partnership. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It was about moving forward together. One afternoon, after they had finished working on a bike, Emily sat down on the worn leather couch, her legs tucked beneath her, and started sketching again. Jake walked over to her and peered over her shoulder. She had drawn a picture of them, riding together, the wind blowing through their hair, the open road in front of them. He smiled softly at the drawing. It was a simple thing, but it meant a lot to him. She was starting to dream again. "You're getting good at this," Jake said, his voice filled with pride. Emily looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I want to be like you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake felt his heart tighten at her words. She didn't have to say it, but he knew exactly what she meant. She wanted to be strong, to be someone who could face the world without fear, someone who could protect herself and those she loved. "You will be," Jake said quietly. "I promise." He didn't know how he could promise something like that, but he said it anyway, knowing deep down that he would do whatever it took to help her get there. The days turned into weeks, and the two of them settled into a routine. The garage became their haven, the place where they could escape from the world outside. They worked on the bikes together, and Jake started teaching Emily more about mechanics. She absorbed every lesson like a sponge, her determination growing with each new task she conquered. Jake could see the changes in her, the way she carried herself with more confidence, the way she smiled more often, the way her eyes sparkled with excitement when she talked about the things she had learned. But despite the progress they had made, Jake couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Something was off. The peace they had found here in the garage was fragile. He knew that the past was never far behind, and sooner or later, someone would come looking for him, for both of them. He tried to push the thought away. He had made a choice when he decided to protect Emily, and he wasn't going to back down from that. But still, he couldn't help but feel a sense of impending danger. One night, as the two of them sat in the garage, working on the bike, they heard a noise outside. The sound of a motorcycle engine revving in the distance. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He stood up abruptly, his instincts kicking in. "Stay here," he said to Emily, his voice low. "Lock the door and don't open it for anyone." Emily's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded without question. Jake moved quickly, grabbing his jacket and making his way outside. The snow had started to fall again, the cold air biting at his skin as he stepped into the yard. The sound of the motorcycle grew louder, closer. Jake's mind raced as he scanned the area. He knew what this meant. Someone was here, and it wasn't just a coincidence. He wasn't sure who it was, but he had a bad feeling about it. As the engine roared closer, Jake's hand instinctively went to the knife he kept hidden in his jacket. He wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt Emily. The motorcycle pulled up to the driveway, its headlights shining through the falling snow. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he waited, his breath visible in the cold air. The bike came to a stop, and the rider dismounted, walking toward him. Jake's body tensed, ready for anything. The rider removed his helmet, revealing a familiar face. It was one of the old members of the Hells Angels, a man Jake hadn't seen in years. "Jake Morrison," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "I think it's time we had a little talk." Jake's heart sank. He knew this was coming, but he wasn't ready for it. Not like this. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing. What do you want? He asked, his voice steady. You know what we want, the man said with a cold smile. It's time for you to come back. The Brotherhood isn't the same without you. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't going back to that life. Not now. Not ever. I'm done with that, Jake said, his voice firm. And I won't go back. Not for anything. The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold anger. You're making a mistake, Jake, he said, his voice low and threatening. The Brotherhood doesn't let people walk away so easily. Jake stood his ground, his hand still gripping the knife in his jacket. He wasn't afraid of this man. He wasn't afraid of anything anymore. I'm not part of your Brotherhood, Jake said, his voice calm but filled with finality. And I'm not going back. Not for you. Not for anyone. The man didn't say another word. He turned and mounted his bike, revving the engine once before speeding off into the night. Jake watched him go, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had made his choice. He had chosen to protect Emily, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even his old brothers, take that away from him. He turned and walked back into the garage, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Emily was waiting inside, her eyes filled with fear. But when she saw him, she relaxed, her shoulders dropping as she breathed a sigh of relief. Jake walked over to her and knelt down. It's okay, he said, his voice soft. No one's going to hurt you. I promise. Jake spent the next few days on edge. The encounter with his old Brotherhood member had unsettled him more than he had expected. He knew the Hells Angels weren't the kind of group that would just let someone walk away. His past was closing in on him, and although he had made it clear that he wasn't going back, the warning from his old comrade echoed in his mind. They don't let people walk away so easily. He had to stay vigilant, not just for his own safety, but for Emily's too. Emily was still adjusting to everything, but she was slowly starting to open up more. She had started to smile more often, and though she was still quiet, her eyes no longer held that constant fear. Jake could see the change in her. She was becoming stronger, more confident, and Jake found himself doing everything he could to keep her safe from the shadows of his past. One afternoon, after they had spent most of the day working on the bikes, Jake decided it was time to take Emily out again. This time, though, he didn't want it to just be a ride to clear his head. He wanted to show her the world, the possibilities outside the garage, outside of Black River. He had promised her a better life, and he was determined to give it to her. How about a real ride? Jake asked Emily, his voice lighter than usual. We can go to the lake, get some air, and just enjoy the day. Emily looked up from her drawing, her brow furrowed in thought. She had never been anywhere outside of Black River, and the idea of venturing out into the unknown seemed both exciting and a little scary. But after a moment, she nodded. Okay, she said quietly. Let's go. Jake smiled and went to prepare the bike. The cold weather was starting to ease up, and the sun was beginning to shine brighter, making it the perfect day for a ride. As they headed out of the garage, Emily sat behind Jake, clutching his jacket as she always did. The wind whipped through their hair as they rode through the familiar streets of Black River, but today it felt different. There was an open road ahead of them, a road full of possibilities. They passed through the town, the scenery changing from the old, worn-down buildings to wide open fields and dirt roads that led into the forest. Jake glanced over his shoulder at Emily, who was staring out at the passing landscape, her eyes wide with wonder. He hadn't realized just how much she had been sheltered, how small her world had become. He had spent so much of his life running from his past that he hadn't seen how much he had missed in the process. He turned onto a dirt road that led to a small lake just outside of town. It was a quiet spot, one Jake had discovered years ago when he needed to clear his mind. He parked the bike by the shore and helped Emily off. They stood there for a moment, the sound of the water gently lapping against the shore filling the air. It's beautiful, Emily said softly, her voice full of awe. Jake nodded, taking a deep breath. Yeah, it's a good place to get away. They sat down on the grass, looking out at the lake. The world felt peaceful here, far removed from the chaos of their past. Emily sat next to him, her legs crossed, her hands resting on her knees. Do you think things will ever get better? She asked, her voice hesitant. Jake glanced at her, surprised by the question. He hadn't expected her to ask something like that, but it made sense. They had both been through so much. They both had scars from the past. I don't know, he said honestly. But I do know one thing. We've got today. And today we're okay. Emily didn't answer at first, but after a long pause, she nodded. Yeah, she said softly. We're okay. The day passed slowly, the two of them sitting in silence, just enjoying the moment. Jake didn't know how long it had been since he had allowed himself to simply be still, to not worry about the next fight or the next challenge. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. But as the sun began to set, the peace was shattered by the roar of a motorcycle engine in the distance. Jake's body tensed immediately, his instincts kicking in. He stood up, scanning the area. Emily looked up at him, concern in her eyes. What is it? She asked. Jake didn't answer right away. He knew something wasn't right. The sound of the motorcycle grew louder, and soon, a figure appeared on the road leading to the lake. The bike came to a stop, and the rider dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward them. Jake's heart sank as the rider's face became clear. It was another one of his old brothers. Jake Morrison, the man said, his voice cold and authoritative. We need to talk. Emily looked at Jake, sensing the tension in the air. She took a step closer to him, her small hand reaching for his. Jake turned to her, giving her a reassuring look. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Stay behind me, he said quietly. The man took another step forward, his eyes locked on Jake. You thought you could just walk away, didn't you? He said, his tone full of accusation. Jake's jaw clenched. I'm done with you, he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet rage. I've got nothing to say to you. The man's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. You can't just leave, Jake. The Brotherhood doesn't let people go. Jake stepped forward, positioning himself between Emily and the man. I've told you already. I'm not coming back, he said firmly. And I won't let you hurt her. The man's eyes flickered to Emily, then back to Jake. This doesn't end here, Jake, he said, his voice low and threatening. You can't escape what you are. With that, the man turned and walked back to his bike, revving the engine before speeding off into the distance. Jake watched him go, his body still tense. He knew this wasn't over. The past had a way of catching up, no matter how far you ran. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. Jake stood there for a moment, the sound of the bike's engine fading into the distance. The tension in the air lingered, thick and heavy. Emily, still standing by his side, looked up at him with wide, concerned eyes. Her grip tightened on his arm as if she could sense the storm brewing, even though it hadn't fully arrived yet. Jake didn't say anything at first, but he could feel the weight of her gaze on him. He turned to her, his voice soft but firm. You're safe, he said, though he didn't quite believe it himself. Not yet. Not with what was coming. The past had a way of following you, of clawing at your heels, no matter how fast you ran or how far you tried to hide. And Jake knew that he couldn't keep Emily hidden in this garage forever. He had promised to protect her, but there was only so much he could do. Emily was quiet, but her gaze never wavered from his face. She had been through so much already, and he didn't want her to see the fear creeping into his heart. She deserved more than that. We need to move, Jake finally said, breaking the silence. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the back of the garage, where he had stored his emergency bag. Inside were the things he never thought he would need again: cash, identification, and a few other essentials that he had kept hidden for years. He didn't want to use them, didn't want to think about running again. But the reality was, if the Hells Angels were really closing in, there was no time to waste. He grabbed the bag and slung it over his shoulder, then turned to Emily. We're leaving, he said. Emily didn't ask questions, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had already trusted him once, and he wasn't going to let her down. Not now. He reached out, gently taking her hand. Come on, he said, his voice softer now. It's time to go. They left the garage together, the cold wind cutting through the air as they stepped out into the fading light of the day. The bike sat waiting, its engine running quietly, ready to take them wherever they needed to go. Jake didn't look back. He couldn't. The past had a way of holding you in place, of making you think you could never escape. But tonight, he was determined to make it different. They rode for miles, the road stretching ahead of them like a ribbon of freedom. Emily sat behind Jake, her hands holding onto him tightly, but Jake could feel the tension in her grip. She was scared, and he didn't blame her. He was scared too. They had no destination in mind, no plan, But Jake wasn't going to stop until he knew they were safe. They stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, a place Jake knew well from his old days. It was quiet, with only a few trucks parked outside. The warmth from the diner's neon lights welcomed them, and Jake felt a brief sense of relief. The inside was empty, save for the old waitress behind the counter. She looked up when they entered, but there was no judgment in her gaze. Just curiosity. "What can I get you, Han?" she asked, her voice warm, though a little tired. Jake glanced at Emily, who still looked a little lost. He smiled at her gently. "We'll have 2 hot chocolates," he said, his voice steady. Emily nodded, her eyes brightening a little. The waitress went to the back to prepare their drinks, and Jake turned back to the table, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stay here forever. As much as he wanted to give Emily a sense of normalcy, a place to rest, Jake knew that it was only a matter of time before the past caught up with them. He couldn't let Emily face that. Not again. As the waitress returned with their drinks, Jake took a deep breath, setting the cup down in front of Emily. "We'll figure this out," he said, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't entirely sure how. She sipped the hot chocolate, her eyes watching him carefully. "You've been doing a good job, Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't used to praise. Not after everything he had done, everything he had been. But hearing Emily say it, hearing her believe in him, made something inside him shift. Maybe he wasn't completely lost after all. Maybe, just maybe, he could make it through this. He smiled at her, the first real smile he had given in a long time. "Thanks, kid," he said. "But we're in this together. Remember that." Emily nodded, her expression serious, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. Hope. As they finished their drinks, Jake stood up, paying the waitress, and leaving a small tip. He motioned for Emily to follow him, and together they walked back out into the cold night. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Emily down. Not now. Not ever. The ride back to the garage was slow, the air still heavy with the tension of what was to come. But this time, Jake didn't feel as afraid. He had a reason to keep fighting now. He had something worth protecting, and that was all that mattered. The days began to blur together as Jake and Emily continued their quiet life in the garage, each day passing with a sense of unease lurking beneath the surface. Jake knew it wasn't a matter of if the Hells Angels would find him, but when. His past had a way of catching up with him, and now, with Emily in his life, it wasn't just his own safety he had to think about. He had made a promise to protect her, and that meant keeping the danger away, no matter the cost. Emily, for her part, seemed to be adjusting more and more to her new life. She was still quiet, but there were moments when she seemed to be truly happy, when she would draw, or when they worked together on the bikes. She was beginning to trust him more, and Jake could see the change in her. She wasn't the frightened child who had been locked in the clubhouse. She was becoming someone stronger. But Jake wasn't sure how much longer they could stay in Black River. Every time he went into town for supplies, he felt the eyes on him, the whispers behind his back. He knew people were starting to ask questions about Emily, about where she had come from and why she was with him. And that meant the heat was starting to turn up. One evening, after they had finished working on a bike, Jake sat in the small office of the garage, going over some old papers. Emily was sitting at the table, working on a new drawing, but Jake could see that something was bothering her. He had learned to read her expressions, to notice the small shifts in her demeanor that told him when something wasn't quite right. She was quiet for too long, and when she finally looked up at him, he saw the uncertainty in her eyes. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we'll ever have to leave?" The question hit Jake harder than he expected. He had been thinking about it for days, but hearing it from Emily made it feel too real. He didn't want to lie to her, but he didn't want to scare her either. "I don't know," he said, his voice steady but filled with the truth of the situation. "But if we have to, we'll go. We'll be all right. You and me, we'll figure it out." Emily nodded, but Jake could see that she wasn't entirely convinced. She didn't say anything else, but her silence spoke volumes. Jake could tell she was still afraid, still uncertain about the future. He couldn't blame her. She had been through so much already, and now she was caught in a situation that wasn't her fault. Jake stood up from the desk and walked over to her. He knelt down beside her, looking at her drawing. It was a picture of the two of them, riding together on the bike, The open road stretched out before them. He smiled softly. "It's a good picture," he said, his voice gentle. Emily looked up at him, her eyes a little brighter. "Do you think we can really go on a trip someday?" she asked. Jake's heart clenched at the innocence of the question. He wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that they could ride off into the sunset and leave all the trouble behind. But he knew that wasn't the reality they were living in. "Maybe," he said softly. "But for now, we take it one day at a time." Emily nodded, but Jake could see that she still wasn't completely reassured. He didn't blame her. They had both been running from something, but he couldn't keep running forever. He had made a promise to her, and now it was time to face the truth. There was no more running. That night, as they sat together, the sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance caught Jake's attention. His body went tense, every muscle on alert. He didn't say anything to Emily, but he could feel her watching him, sensing his change in demeanor. The engine grew louder, and soon a figure appeared in the headlights. Jake's heart raced as the rider pulled up to the garage. The bike's engine cut off, and the rider dismounted, walking toward him. Jake recognized him immediately, another old member of the Hells Angels. The man's face was familiar, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "Jake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You've been avoiding us for long enough." Jake stood up, his body tense, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he kept tucked in his jacket. Emily stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. Jake gave her a look, signaling for her to stay back, but his attention never left the man. "I've told you before," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'm done with that life. I'm not going back." The man's expression darkened. "You don't get to make that choice," he said, his voice filled with menace. "You can't just walk away, Jake. You belong to the Brotherhood, and we don't let people leave." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going back. Not for anyone. "I'm not going back," he repeated, his voice steady. "And you're not going to hurt her." The man's eyes flickered to Emily, and for a moment, Jake could see the calculation in his gaze. But then the man turned away, his expression cold. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low, before mounting his bike and speeding off into the night. Jake stood there for a moment, watching him disappear. He knew this wasn't over, but for now, they were safe. He turned back to Emily, who was still standing by the door, her face pale. "It's okay," Jake said, his voice calm. "No one's going to hurt you. I'll make sure of that." Emily didn't say anything, but she nodded, her small frame trembling slightly. Jake walked over to her and put his hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll be okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. But he was going to try. For her. The days following the encounter with the Hells Angels member were tense, and Jake could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He couldn't afford to be complacent, not with Emily depending on him. She was still adjusting to their new life together, and though she was growing more confident, Jake knew the danger hadn't passed. The Brotherhood wasn't the type to let go of one of their own so easily. Every morning, as Jake got ready to start the day, he found himself looking out the window, half expecting to see a familiar face standing there. But each time, it was just the quiet town of Black River. The sound of the wind and the rustling trees outside the garage were the only things breaking the silence. Despite the calm outside, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Emily, too, seemed to sense the change. She wasn't the same carefree girl she had been when she first came to him. She was quieter now, her eyes often far away as if she were lost in thought. Jake hated seeing her like this, knowing that the world had already stolen so much of her childhood. He had promised to protect her, and he was doing everything he could to keep her safe, but he knew that eventually, they couldn't stay hidden forever. One afternoon, as they worked together on a bike in the garage, Emily looked up from her tools, her face serious. "Jake," she said softly, "what happens if they come back?" Jake felt his stomach tighten at the question. He had known this conversation was coming. He had tried to avoid it, tried to protect her from the harsh reality of their situation. But now, standing in front of him, Emily was looking at him with the kind of determination that reminded him of himself at her age. "I won't let them hurt you," Jake said, his voice firm but with a hint of vulnerability he couldn't hide. Emily didn't seem satisfied with the answer. "But what if they do?" she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake stopped what he was doing, staring at her for a moment. He could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty that had been growing within her since their run-in with the Hells Angels. He wasn't sure what to say. He had always prided himself on being able to handle any situation, but this was different. Protecting Emily was different. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe," he finally said, his voice quieter this time. "We've got each other, and that's all that matters." Emily nodded, though Jake could see the doubt still in her eyes. She didn't know what the future held, and neither did he. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Jake sat in the small office of the garage, thinking. The situation was becoming more dangerous, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before the Hells Angels came looking for him again. He had already tried to distance himself from that world, but they wouldn't let him go that easily. And now, with Emily in his life, it was even more important to stay out of their reach. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to figure out what to do next. He couldn't keep running forever, but he also couldn't stay in Black River, not with the threat still hanging over them. As he sat there, lost in thought, a noise outside the garage caught his attention. A low rumble of engines. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one bike this time. It was a group. He stood up quickly, moving toward the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he kept hidden in his jacket. He didn't know who it was, but he had a bad feeling. The bikes pulled up outside, their engines roaring to a stop. Jake's pulse quickened as he peered out the small window of the garage. The headlights of the motorcycles lit up the yard, casting long shadows. There was no time to waste. Jake moved quickly, grabbing Emily's arm gently but firmly. "Get up," he whispered urgently. "We need to go. Now." Emily's eyes widened in fear as she saw the panic in Jake's face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer right away. He didn't want to scare her, but the danger was real, and he wasn't going to take any chances. "Just trust me," he said, his voice low. "I need you to stay quiet and follow me." He led her to the back of the garage, where the door opened up into the woods behind the property. Jake had already planned for a situation like this. He knew every escape route, every hiding place in the area. But he hadn't expected things to get this bad. He hadn't expected the Hells Angels to come after him so soon. They made their way through the woods, the sound of the bikes growing fainter behind them. Jake could feel the adrenaline surging through his body, his senses heightened. He knew they couldn't go far. The woods were dense, but they weren't going to hide forever. They needed to get out of town, and fast. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked down at her, his heart aching. "We're going to find somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere we can figure out what to do next." They continued walking through the woods, their steps careful and quiet. Jake's mind was racing, trying to think of a plan, but nothing seemed to come to him. He had always been able to handle situations on his own, but now, with Emily depending on him, it was different. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he knew they couldn't stay here. The Hells Angels were closing in, and there was nowhere left to hide. Jake moved through the woods with urgency, every step calculated as he led Emily deeper into the dense forest. The cold air bit at their skin, but it was the weight of the situation that made the chill feel unbearable. Every few seconds, he glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see headlights cutting through the trees, the sound of roaring engines too close for comfort. Emily followed closely behind, her small hand gripping his jacket as they moved through the shadows. She didn't speak, but Jake could feel the tremble in her fingers, the fear that was still lurking within her. They had only been on the run for a short time, but already, it felt like a lifetime. The world around them had shifted, and it seemed like nothing was the same anymore. Jake had never imagined a life like this. The Hells Angels, his past, was catching up to him, and he couldn't protect Emily forever if they kept pushing him into corners. But he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. He glanced at Emily again, seeing the way her eyes darted nervously at every rustle in the woods. He hated that she had to experience this, the constant fear, the uncertainty of what would happen next. He should have been able to shield her from all of it, but he couldn't. He wasn't the man he used to be, the man who took what he wanted, the man who fought without hesitation. That man was gone, and in his place was someone who only wanted to protect the girl walking beside him. After what felt like hours, they reached an old cabin Jake had used as a hideout during his younger years. It was tucked away in a remote part of the forest, barely visible among the thick trees. Jake pushed open the creaking door and ushered Emily inside. It was dark and musty, but it was safe, at least for now. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the small window. Jake immediately went to work, locking the door and securing the windows. Emily stood by the door, watching him with wide eyes. She was silent, but Jake could see the unease still written on her face. "We're safe for now," Jake said, his voice low but steady. He didn't know how long they could stay here, but it would have to be enough for the moment. Emily nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She hadn't spoken much since they started running, but Jake could tell the weight of everything was starting to sink in. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they find us?" Her question hung in the air, a reminder of the danger that still loomed over them. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. He didn't want to lie to her. He didn't want to sugarcoat the reality of their situation. "If they find us," he said slowly, "we'll deal with it. Together." Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for some reassurance. Jake wasn't sure he had it in him to give her all the answers she needed, but he could give her one thing, his word. "We'll be all right," he said, even if he wasn't entirely sure of it himself. Emily nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. She wasn't a child anymore. Not really. Not with everything she had been through. But Jake was determined to shield her from the worst of it, no matter the cost. He turned away, moving to the corner of the cabin where an old cot lay against the wall. He had to think. They couldn't stay here forever. He needed a plan, and he needed to come up with one fast. The Hells Angels weren't going to give up. Not when one of their own had walked away. He grabbed a worn map from a drawer, spreading it out on the small wooden table. Emily walked over, standing beside him, her eyes scanning the map. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice quiet but curious. Jake ran his finger along the road marked on the map, tracing the lines as if they could lead him to answers. "I'm not sure yet," he said, his voice low. "We need to get out of the area. Far away from here. We'll lay low, keep moving until it's safe again." Emily studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "But where will we go?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Jake admitted, shaking his head. "I'll figure it out. We'll find somewhere." Emily didn't say anything else, but Jake could feel her hesitation. She was afraid, just like him, but she didn't want to show it. She was trying to be strong for him, just like he was trying to be strong for her. He reached over and gently placed his hand on hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We're in this together," he said, his voice firm. Emily finally looked up at him, her face softening. She nodded, but Jake could see that she still carried the weight of their situation on her shoulders. It wasn't easy for either of them. The road ahead was uncertain, but he had made a promise to her. No matter what happened, no matter how long they had to run, Jake wasn't going to let her down. Not now. Not ever. He leaned back in his chair, trying to think of their next move, but the sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance broke his concentration. The rumble of the engine grew louder, and Jake's muscles tensed. It wasn't just one bike this time. It was a group. He couldn't ignore it any longer. They were here. Jake's hand instinctively reached for the knife he kept tucked in his jacket. The time for running was over. He wasn't going to let them take Emily, not without a fight. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, the engines rumbling through the quiet night like an approaching storm. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his grip tightening on the knife hidden under his jacket. He could feel Emily's presence behind him, her breath shallow and quick with fear, but he couldn't let her see it. He had to remain calm. He had to keep it together. The bikes were getting closer. Jake moved swiftly to the window, peering through the thin curtains. A line of headlights cut through the darkness, their silhouettes sharp against the night. He counted at least 5 bikes, maybe more. They were coming for him. For them. His pulse quickened. "Emily," Jake whispered, turning to her. She was already looking at him, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "Stay down," he instructed, his voice low and steady, but laced with urgency. Emily nodded, but she didn't move. She wasn't a child anymore, not in the way he had hoped she would be. She was brave, stronger than most adults he knew. Jake's mind raced. He could hear the bikes pulling up, the rumbling noise shaking the walls of the cabin. He needed a plan, but time was running out. They were almost here. He moved to the door, checking the locks again, making sure everything was secure. Emily stepped closer, her hand reaching for his sleeve. "Jake, what's going to happen?" Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. Jake's throat tightened, but he didn't show it. He couldn't. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I say it's safe." Emily hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of reassurance. She didn't find any, but she nodded anyway, her face pale and drawn with worry. Jake walked over to the corner of the room, slipping the knife from his jacket, his fingers wrapped around the cold steel. He didn't want to use it, but he was ready. He had no choice. The bikes had stopped outside. He could hear their engines idle, the sound hanging in the air like a warning. He moved toward the back door, peering through a crack in the wood, trying to get a glimpse of who was out there. He couldn't make out any faces in the shadows, but he knew they were here. They weren't just going to let him go. They never did. The door to the cabin rattled suddenly, the sound of heavy boots hitting the ground. Someone was at the door. Jake's muscles tensed. His heart raced. He took a deep breath and stepped back, positioning himself between Emily and the door. There was no going back now. The knock came again, louder this time. Jake didn't move, his hand resting on the handle of the knife. He wasn't sure who was out there, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't letting them take Emily. The door creaked as it opened, the figure of a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, wearing the same leather jacket with the Hells Angels patch that Jake had worn in the past. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Jake knew who he was. It was Viper, the president of the chapter, a man Jake had once considered a brother. "Jake Morrison," Viper said, his voice low and threatening. "We've been looking for you." Jake's grip on the knife tightened, but he kept his stance steady. "I'm not going back," he said, his voice calm, though his heart was racing. Viper's eyes narrowed, the faint glow from the lantern in the corner illuminating his face. "You think you can just walk away?" he sneered, his voice thick with disdain. "You're one of us. You don't get to leave. Not like this." Jake stepped forward, keeping his eyes locked on Viper's. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "I'm done," Jake said, his voice unwavering. "I walked away, and there's nothing you can do to change that." Viper's gaze flickered to the side for a moment, as if calculating his next move. "We'll see about that," he said, his tone dripping with menace. He nodded, signaling to the men behind him. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the sound of boots shuffling on the dirt floor echoed through the cabin. There were more of them. Jake had known this was coming, but the sight of them standing there, 5 men in total, made his blood run cold. "You don't have to do this, Viper," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going back, and you can't force me." Viper's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You don't get it, do you? It's not just about you. It's about the Brotherhood. Your family. And family doesn't just walk away." Jake could feel the pressure building inside him, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not for anyone. "I'm not your family anymore," Jake said. "I have a new family now." Viper's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a low growl. "You can run, Jake, but you can't hide. We'll find you. And when we do, there won't be a place you can hide." He turned to leave, but not before one last threat. "You've made a mistake, Jake. You'll regret it." As the door slammed shut behind him, Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced over at Emily, who was standing in the corner, her face pale with fear. She had heard everything. He walked over to her, dropping the knife onto the table. "It's okay," he said, his voice softer now. "We're safe for now." Emily didn't say anything, but she nodded, her eyes still wide with fear. Jake knew this wasn't over. It wasn't just a matter of running anymore. They couldn't keep hiding forever. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance. A chance to fight for Emily, to protect her from the past he couldn't escape. And he was ready to do whatever it took. The silence in the cabin was thick with tension, the air heavy with the unspoken words between Jake and Emily. She had heard everything. The threats, the promises, the weight of Jake's past pressing down on them both. Jake stood by the window, his hand gripping the edge of the sill, staring out into the night. The sound of the motorcycles had long faded, but their presence still lingered like a shadow, a reminder that they couldn't outrun the past forever. Emily sat on the worn couch, her gaze distant, lost in her thoughts. Jake's heart ached as he looked at her. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe from everything that haunted him. But the Hell's Angels were still out there, and as much as he wanted to believe that they could disappear into the shadows and leave it all behind, he knew better. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep hiding. Jake turned away from the window, walking over to Emily. She didn't look up at him when he sat down beside her, but he could feel the weight of her gaze on him. "We're not safe here," Jake said softly, his voice low. "I thought we could keep running, keep hiding, but I was wrong. The Brotherhood doesn't forget." Emily nodded, her hands twisting together in her lap. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't have an answer. He had never been the type to plan for the future, to think ahead beyond the next ride or the next job. He had always been about survival, living in the moment. But now, with Emily in his life, he couldn't afford to live like that anymore. He had to think about her future, about the life he wanted to build for her. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "But I'll figure it out. We'll figure it out, together." He looked at her, his eyes steady, his resolve hardening. "I'll keep you safe, Emily. No matter what." For a moment, Emily didn't say anything, but then she reached for his hand, her small fingers closing around his. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to tell Jake that she was with him, that she believed in him, despite everything. The weight of the world hadn't broken her spirit, and that gave him hope. Maybe they could still make it out of this alive. The night stretched on in silence, the only sound the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. Jake's mind raced with possibilities, but he knew that right now, there was nothing they could do but wait. The Hell's Angels would be back, and when they did, he had to be ready. The next morning, Jake woke up early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. Emily was still asleep, curled up on the couch with the blanket wrapped tightly around her. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her. He had never imagined that his life would take such a turn, that he would be here, protecting someone who had so much more to live for than he did. Emily was young, still innocent in so many ways. She deserved a life full of possibilities, full of the things Jake had never allowed himself to have. But for now, this was the life they had, and he would protect it with everything he had. Jake stepped outside, the cold morning air hitting him as he made his way to the back of the cabin. The woods were quiet, the only sound the crunch of the snow under his boots. He took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. He had to make a decision. He couldn't keep hiding, but he also couldn't fight the entire Brotherhood alone. He needed help. The thought made his stomach twist. He didn't want to drag anyone else into this, didn't want to involve anyone else in the mess he had created. But the truth was, he was out of options. He had one last place to turn. Jake reached for his phone, the screen lit up by a name he hadn't called in years. He hesitated for a moment before hitting the dial button. The phone rang, the sound too loud in the quiet of the woods. It rang again, and again. Just as Jake was about to hang up, a voice answered. "Jake," the voice said, gruff but familiar. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again." It was Pete Hawkins, an old friend, someone Jake had known from his days with the Hell's Angels. Pete had always been a straight shooter, someone who had never bought into the Brotherhood's nonsense. He had walked away from it years ago, just like Jake. "Pete," Jake said, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "I need your help." Pete was silent for a moment. Jake could almost hear him weighing his options. "You know I don't get involved in your shit anymore, Jake," Pete finally said, his voice tired. "But I'll listen. What's going on?" Jake told him everything. About the Hell's Angels, about the threat they posed, about Emily and the life he was trying to protect. Pete listened quietly, not interrupting, but Jake could feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. When Jake finished, Pete was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "All right," Pete said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll help you, but we need to act fast. You know I've got a few connections left, but we don't have much time." Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thanks, Pete," he said quietly. "You don't know how much this means." Pete's response was a low chuckle. "I don't do this for you, Jake. I'm doing this for the kid." Jake smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in days, he felt like there was a chance, a way out of this mess. With Pete's help, they could finally get away from the Hell's Angels. But they would have to move quickly. Jake went back inside, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. Emily was still asleep, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of her breath. He didn't want to wake her, didn't want to worry her. But he knew that the time to act was now. He had to get her to safety. Jake walked over to her and gently shook her awake. She blinked up at him, still groggy from sleep. We're moving today, Jake said softly. Pack your things. It's time to go.